And if you want to see a praise, you can look to Jess earlier today when Nathan was sitting there all by himself, no hands on him, just completely on his own, sitting up. One of the interesting things with technology is when you forget to save your own thing and don't put the reading that you're supposed to have on there. That's okay, I have it up there so I can just turn around and read right off of that. My reading for today is fairly short. It comes from Exodus chapter 16, verses 1 through 3. Luke is the next slide. The whole Israelite community set out from Elim and came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had come out of Egypt. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death." I picked that reading. I found out what my limits of my camera were today, and it doesn't include down there and walking over here. I picked that reading, and there's been sort of a theme that I've been looking at, and it has to do with this idea of being lost in the wilderness. A couple of weeks ago, a month ago, there was a story about a couple of California teens that had decided to go out on Easter and go hiking together. 18 and 19 years old, and they're out in California. Well, they're not, they weren't out in the deserts of California. They were in, the LA basin. They were, in a major metropolitan area. They'd gone to a wooded area, an area known for hiking. It was a nature area, and they'd gone out hiking. They managed to get lost. And if you're familiar with California, that area, you might think, how do you get lost in that kind of, it's a big city area. How do you get lost? Fritz, pay attention. I hear you're going out there. Don't get lost on us. But they did. Their car had been found. Their parents had called in and said, hey, they were supposed to be back a long time ago. Their car was found. They weren't there. That started a long and exhaustive search. Actually went for several days as they tried to find these kids. What's interesting is that they did find both of them, and what's really interesting is where they found them. They found the young man first, and people were, where did he get separated? They found him. He had no shoes. He had no food, no water. But they found him within a quarter mile of his car. But he was totally lost. He had no idea where he was, no idea where he was going. A quarter mile from his car. They got some information about the young lady, and they continued to search. The rescuers went to great lengths, and eventually they did find the young lady. And she was really on the face of a rock area. They said they refer to it as a yoga mat. I don't know how big a yoga mat is. I don't think it's real big. They found her on a small outcropping of rock, 150 feet from a major thoroughfare, a major highway in California. Completely lost. She had no idea where she was. She had no idea where to go, and had no idea how to get there. But she was 150 feet from a major highway. If she had simply walked and hit that highway, she would have been perfectly fine because cars go down it every day, all the time. Here you have two kids in the middle of what has to be one of the largest metropolitan areas in the world, and they're lost mere hundreds of yards from where they need to be found. In the youth CEF, we've been talking about these ideas. This idea of being lost in the wilderness, being out out away from people and away from civilization. And we've been using the Israelites and their journey out of Egypt as a basis for that study. And one of the interesting things is we started looking into that, and it was news to me. It was something I learned. The total trip that the Israelites took when they fled from Egypt to the promised land? Anyone have any idea how far they traveled? They were out there for 40 years, right? 40 years of travel. How far did they go? Benjamin's raising his hand because he's been through the class. Anyone know? 10,000 miles? 5,000 miles? Benjamin's head's going to explode if I don't call on him. Benjamin, how far did they travel?
100 miles.
About 100 miles. 40 years, they traveled 100 miles. Doesn't make sense, does it? 40 years, you could wander back and forth over the same 100-mile grid and get where you're going. But they didn't. They were lost. Lost in the wilderness, lost in the desert for 40 years to travel 100 miles. And they took the long way. Had they just went, they could have gone, they took this big arc, this big loop, and they could have just traveled straight there and been much shorter. But they couldn't do it. And there was no way they could do it. I think we all understand. There's no way that the Israelites were getting from Egypt to the promised land in 40 years. Because there were things they needed to do. Things they needed to go through and things they needed to understand before they could get there. And I think if you look at Whiting for the last, some would say far too long, but the last year and a half, 2 years, it feels the same way. It feels like we haven't come all that far. But I think if we were to look at it, we would realize that the church during the interim period is no different than the Israelites leaving Egypt and going to the promised land. We've had to wander. We've had to go through things. We've had to learn. We've had to discover. And maybe we've had to have a little bit of pain. We face some of the similar struggles, some of the same things, and we've had the same concerns. One of the things that we have to look at as we think about this interim period is the same thing that the Israelites had to think about as they were going through their being lost in the wilderness. One of the things we have to think about is the leadership. And the question I have is leadership from God or from man? They're sometimes difficult to sort out. There are people in the church who we look to, they're sort of the natural leaders. We know what they do and we know the things that they're good at. And we hope that that leadership comes from God, but sometimes we have to think about whether or not it does. The Israelites faced a similar struggle. We all know about Moses. We learned Moses leads the Israelites out of Egypt. Moses leads them through the desert, and he's the guy that goes up the mountain. And we like to think that he was selected by God. I believe he was selected by God because in Exodus 3:10, that's what we're told. In Exodus 3:10, it says, "So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." That's a commissioning. It's a really short one, but it's a commissioning. God told Moses, go and do. But what happens is Moses goes and he does. And as soon as, we just read about the Israelites grumbling, as soon as they they're no sooner, they're freed from slavery, they're out of the oppression of the Egyptians under which they were being killed and beaten and, going through horrible, horrible existence. And the first thing they do is start to complain about food. God resolves that, but it doesn't take long before the Israelites are grumbling again. And all of a sudden, we find something different happening. Because in Exodus 32, starting in verse 1, we read, "When the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said, 'Come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him.'" So here you have the Israelites. They've been led out of slavery. They've been led out of captivity by Moses. He's gone to talk with God, physically, directly, on the mountain, covered in a cloud of lightning. He's talking to God. And the Israelites, well, he's gone. We don't know what happened to him. We pick you. And they point to Aaron. Now, Aaron helped Moses. It's not, Aaron was a leader. But Aaron wasn't the leader selected and commissioned by God to lead the Israelites at that time. The Israelites didn't listen to that. They said, well, we don't like the way that's going. We're going to pick Aaron to lead us instead. And Aaron, he listened. He did. They picked him. So he does what they wanted. He starts making a golden calf and does, what the people want and doesn't go out so well. That doesn't turn out right. Because Aaron was not the leader chosen by God to do what was needed. Just like that, we know that God has a plan. He always has a plan for His church. He had a plan for the Israelites, He had a plan for the early church, and He has a plan for this church at this time. What we have to make sure is that we're praying to God for the wisdom to hear God's voice instead of man's voice. The search committee has been through a great deal in the last 2 years, and the search committee has discerned and hopefully has properly discerned the will of God. And we're bringing a gentleman in next week to preach to the church. But the church as a whole needs to pray for the wisdom to make the choice that God wants. That's very difficult at times, and it's prayer that we need to be thinking about for the next week. Because next week we have to make that choice. And we want to be able to hear God saying, this is what's right, as opposed to the people saying, Aaron is what's right. So it's a calling on each of us for the next week to be ready to listen and to meet and to hear and to discern whether the process has gone properly. The search committee can only make a presentation and offer someone. The people of the church have to make the choice. In the same way, as the Israelites, I talked about them starting to grumble and being upset when they left Egypt. And in Exodus 14, verses 11 and 12, we read about that. This is right after they fled. They've just left. The Egyptians are still chasing them. It says, as Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us, bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. And in the same way, in Exodus chapter 16, they say, in the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted, but you have brought us into the desert to starve this entire assembly to death. Should recognize that because that was the initial reading. The Israelites knew how bad it was in Egypt. There's no question. They knew it was bad. And they figured, if we can just get out of slavery, if we can just get away from Egypt, everything will be better. They got away from Egypt. They got away from Pharaoh. They got away from all of the oppression. And immediately turning, it was so much better back there. Everything was better. The challenges of the church continue to be the challenges of the church. We're going to move forward in the next weeks, regardless of what happens next week. We're going to move forward with a new pastor or continuing to search for a new pastor. But one of the things we have to remember is that God's plan remains the same. We have to continue to face day to day those struggles that He throws our way, and we have to accept the gifts that He gives us. But for us to look and say, we can just do this, everything will be better. The Israelites learned that's not the case. Just because you get out of one situation doesn't mean that everything is suddenly golden and beautiful. The challenges that face the church continue to exist. And finally, we need to think about what happens at the end of the journey. The end of the journey for the Israelites came when Joshua was commissioned by Moses to take over the leadership of the nation. They've been traveling for 40 years, remember. They've been out in the wilderness, covered the distance that they needed to cover. And the 100 miles doesn't cover it. They had learned to depend on God instead of themselves. They learned to exist on the manna and the quail that God provided them on a daily basis. They had learned to listen to God's will instead of trying to demand to do things their own way, which is the whole lesson of why they had been in Egypt in the first place, and it was the reason it took them 40 years to travel 100 miles. Joshua was commissioned as the leader when God said, "Now you're ready. Now you're ready for the change that is coming, and you're ready to move forward to the next step." The next step was the promised land. Moses handed leadership of the Israelites over to Joshua. That wasn't the end of their struggles, though. The promised land was there, but it didn't just walk in. It wasn't, Willy Wonka in the chocolate factory where everything is beautiful and golden. They went into the promised land and there were people there. There were people there who didn't necessarily agree with them. They had to fight, and they had to work, and they had to earn the promised land. The change into the promised land was the beginning of a new struggle, not the end of all struggles. The other thing they had to do was to shift and adapt their understanding. They had to change, to be ready for new leadership. Joshua was not Moses. He was a different leader. They had to be ready for it. They had to change. They had to be ready for what Joshua would bring. And then they had to shift from this mentality of just getting by, which is what they did. On a day-to-day basis, they relied on God, and they got their manna and their quail, and they were able to survive. And they had to change and shift their thinking from getting by to the awesome opportunities that the promised land offered. There were new ministries and new things they were going to be able to do. But they had to be ready to accept that task and to undertake it and to do it according to God's will. We have to be ready to respond when God calls, because that change can come awfully quick. In Joshua 1, verses 1 and 2, we read about the death of Moses and what happened. It says, "After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' aide, 'Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, you and all these people get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I am about to give to them, to the Israelites.'" Moses died, and the first words out of God's mouth were, "There's the Jordan River, cross it." They didn't spend another 40 years getting ready for Joshua to lead them. They didn't spend another decade trying to get ready to go into the promised land. Moses died, and God said, "Go." And they went. The rest of the story takes up the rest of the Old Testament. But it took decades to get there, and then the call came extraordinarily quickly. Whiting has been in a situation for 2 years where we have been learning about ourselves. We've been learning about God's call to the church. We've been learning about what our needs are and what God's needs are for the church. We're in a situation now where we feel like we've been wandering in the desert for 40 years. We're in a situation now where God is going to call on us to make the decision concerning the leadership of this church moving forward. God's call is going to come, and He's going to need an answer, and once that answer is made, we're going to move forward. It's not going to be a situation of deciding, for the next 2 years what we do. It's going to be deciding what we do now. We have 7 days in which to pray about it, because the long journey is coming to an end one way or another. When God calls on us, we have to be ready to respond. But we can't respond with our heads or our hearts. We have to be ready to respond according to God's will. So my prayer for the next week, as we get ready for Pastor Nick to stand in this pulpit and provide his message, is that we hear not only what Pastor Nick has to say, but more importantly, what God has to say.
witnessing with the sending him, immortal, invisible God and promise.
Given the nature of the week that we face and the week that we've just completed, I think it only appropriate to turn to Numbers for a blessing that we're provided. As we go out this week, I would ask that the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace this day and always. Go in his will.